My name is Pamela Bella Nyamutoka Katooro. You can call me Pamela. And IIRR's Africa Regional Director, and I'll be moderating today's session, where we will have an interactive session about what are the implications of the African Free Trade Area Agreement. And more specifically, we want to see how is the Free Trade Agreement going to have this impact that we're envisioning it to create. It's the African Free Trade Agreement is right now the single biggest market in the world, because it has about 54 African countries, that have signed into it, and it's meant to facilitate the movement of capital, people, and investments through gradually opening up the markets. The recent World Bank study report on the impact of this agreement on rural people said that it could benefit up to 30 million people getting out of poverty. And we are honored to have one of the authors of this report, Dr. Echandi, among our panelists. So the free trade agreement really has this potential to create regional value chains and reduce the gender wage gap. So we hope that indeed it will live up to its aspirations. As IIRR, this is a very interesting discourse for us, because we've been active in empowering rural communities, specifically in the agriculture and education sectors across Africa. Looking and we've seen the issues that affect rural communities, and right from even market conditions not being very favorable, weather conditions, information, financial literacy, and all these areas that are being covered under the, and that could potentially affect the implementation of this agreement. And even with all these development efforts that, are meant to help people, lift people out of poverty, we want to see how will this agreement actually span that growth into realization. So today's schedule will feature a first part in which each of our guest speakers will present on their insights on the AfCFTA, and then we'll give an opportunity to the audience to present their questions to the guest speakers. You can type them into the Q&A box. Feel free to send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll be collecting them and address them at the end. So first of all, let me introduce you to our panelists today. We have Dr. Roberto Echandi, who's a lead trade specialist in the trade unit of the Microeconomics, Trade and Investment Global Practice of the World Bank Group. He was formerly the Director of Programs on International Investment at the World Trade Institute, University of Bern. He has been Ambassador of Costa Rica to the Kingdom of Belgium, Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, and the European Union, and has been the chief negotiator for Costa Rica for more than a decade in numerous international negotiations, such as the association agreement between Central America and the European Union. And he went to the University of Michigan School of Law, where he did his doctoral studies in international law, trade law. So we are honored to have Dr. Echandi here. And as I mentioned before, he's one of the authors for the World Bank report on the implications of the African Free Trade Area Agreement. And so we'll be looking forward to hearing live his insights on this webinar. Our second panelist is Dr. Andrew Agyei-Holmes. He's a native of the Afoi-Tafo region in Ghana, and has worked and lived in the UK and Tanzania as a researcher. He's currently the research fellow at the Institute of Statistical, Social and Economic Research at the University of Ghana. And his recent work has focused on rural business centers, the sustainability of cocoa production in Ghana, and the impact of COVID in sub-Saharan Africa's food systems. He previously worked at the World Bank on gender innovations in Africa, and he holds a PhD in international development economics from the Open University. Dr. Andrew, you are very welcome. Our third panelist is Miss Neva Sadikoglu-Novaky is the Business Sustainability Lead for Africa and the Middle East for Syngenta. And prior to joining Syngenta, Neva was with the EU institutions for 10 years at the Commission, Parliament, and Committee of the Regions, where she worked as the Secretary General. She has also been an AILA International Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., and holds a master's degree from LSE. So please join me to welcome our distinguished panelists. Thank you very much. This is all for me now. And without further ado, I will invite Dr. Echandi to make his presentation. Dr. Echandi, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pamela. And it's a pleasure and honor for me to be together with you and my colleagues, Andrew and Neva, in this important topic, which is actually what is the Africa Continental FTA about and how can it affect rural communities and how to maximize the benefits. So I will ask Tamoy, yes, if you can put. I will do a very quick description of the kind of research and work that we were doing. Pamela mentioned these studies that the World Bank is undertaking, and we did the first study on the distributional effects of the negotiation of the Africa Continental FTA. But let's start in talking what it's all about. So if we can move to the next slide, Tamoy, please. So the Africa Continental FTA is basically a free trade area, right? An agreement that will link 54 countries with 1.3 billion people and a combined potential GDP of 3.4 trillion into one market. Of all those 54 countries, 35 have already ratified the agreement, and some countries are still in the process of ratification. Now, the negotiation is taking place on stages. So you know that the agreement was negotiated first, the normative part, and entered into force in 2019. But the real beef or the real substance of the concessions are taking place through the protocols. So there's the protocols on trading goods and trading services. There will be a second stage that has not yet begun and is on intellectual property, competition, and investment issues, and then a third phase on e-commerce. Now, if you go to the next slide, so this is basically what we're talking about. This is a negotiation, and in terms of liberalization of trading goods on tangible things, this is the tariff liberalization schedule. The tariffs will be cut progressively. It's not that there will be free trade immediately, and actually would be basically on stages and give more time to LDCs countries. So, for example, here in the graphic, you see that in the case of LDCs, there will be a liberalization on non-sensitive products for 10 years that will start in 2021, actually in July, and will last until 2031. But the sensitive tariff lines will be phased on 13 years, starting on the 6th year. So that means that free trade on some sensitive products will not start until 6 years and finish until 2034. In the case, but then in addition, there will be 3% of products that will not be liberated at all, that have been excluded. The non-LDCs are going a little faster. It's still, that means that we will not have free trade until 2031 in those cases, right? Now, what are the key impacts of this? The agreement basically lowers the tariffs. So there might be in the short run a tariff revenue decrease for some governments, but it's not as much as we thought that it would be. It's less than 1.5% for most countries. However, in the long run, the increase in the volume of trade will lead to a higher tariff revenue collection, right? If we go to the next slide, I think this is the most important part. The free trade agreement will have, if correctly implemented, this I want to emphasize this. We're talking about, this is our research and these are numbers, but in order to make these numbers come alive, there has to be some concrete implementation on the ground. But the potential is, in terms of income, there's $450 billion in income gains from Africa. The tariff liberalization alone would boost income by 0.2%. However, one of the key conclusions have been that the main problem in Africa is not only the tariffs, is logistics, is the distance, is what you call non-tariff barriers, time that you wait at the border, lines, red tape, etc. So if we eliminate those non-tariff barriers, the predictive income multiplies and it will be 2.4%. So the trade, if we follow all the commitments that countries in Africa have already undertaken in the WTO, those that are WTO members, the trade facilitation with tariff and NTM liberalization, I mean, when we deal with these non-tariff barriers, the yield will be 7%. Leading to an increase in trade of $560 billion, right? Especially in intra-African exports, an increase of up to 80%. And this is the most important part, the social phase of this has the possibility to lift 30 million out of people lifted out of extreme poverty and 68 million people lifted out of moderate poverty, and better opportunities for unskilled workers and women, with wages increasing faster by 10%. So even the women are very likely to be one of the key winners if this is actually implemented in ground. So if we go to the next slide, quickly, these are some real welfare implications that we calculated by 2035 relative to a baseline in different countries. But I just would like to go to the next slide and make the following reflection. How all this work? This work is, I mean, how do we translate these numbers or these things into real impact? It's not only an issue of how to implement the agreement, but also, let me just explain. If the free trade liberalizes in Africa, then the market will become bigger, and then investors will be more interested in undertaking economic activities. Now, this study that we're sharing with you is the effects, the immediate effects of liberalization of non-tariff barriers and trade facilitation in goods. However, we're doing another study now on how investment would behave. This is what we call the dynamic effects. And we are in that process of finishing this year. And hopefully, I mean, we expect that the impact will be even higher, because the creation of the market itself will make Africa more interesting from an economic point of view for investors, and there will be activities that are not taking place today. So the possibilities for job creation and the possibilities for economic transformation will be even higher if we manage to attract that investment, right? Now, going to the topic of today, which is rural development, the key point, I mean, why is this important for rural development? For a lot of reasons. The obvious point that a lot of us think when rural development is agriculture. And here, this is a graphic that was prepared by Tralac. This is not from the World Bank. And it's a kind of a synthesis. There was a study done on agriculture within Africa. And there are some key features that we have to bear in mind. Excluding South Africa, basically, intra-Africa agricultural trade represents around 12% of African agricultural exports with the rest of the world. So it's not, I mean, the potential for growth of intra-African trade is big. However, that trade today is limited and is concentrated in key products. We're talking about today of sugar, tea, cigarettes, other vegetables, and palm oil. And most of the trade is actually concentrated among neighboring countries. And an important point here to bear in mind is that a significant part of trade within countries is informal. So all these numbers that I'm telling you are basically numbers of what we know of formal firms, but we could expect that there's more trade happening. And the idea will be that if the opportunities increase, we should have, and if the governments do not harass the small businesses with taxes and other things, the rate informalization should gradually begin to increase. Last but not least, the main problem, again, as I mentioned to you, of intra-African trade in agriculture is not the exception, is not the tariffs themselves. It's basically infrastructure, lack of connectivity, and red tape, transactional costs that inhibit the growth of trade among countries. Now, trade, agriculture is only one part of the story. I think that if we want to go, if we go to the next slide, I think we have to see the Continental FTA for an opportunity to talk and for the opportunity for changing the status quo in Africa. Right now, Africa is fragmented. Right now, the integration in Africa has been taking place through regional economic communities, and there's a logic for that. I mean, I don't challenge. I don't want to second guess that. But the key point of the Continental Africa FTA is that it's for the first time in history, actually, that the actors, you, people, civil society, governments, and investors are visualizing the continent as a whole, not as fragments. Also, the whole point of this is that because there's a need for Africa to shift from trade and investment patterns, focus on natural resources, and look for economic diversification, and via regional and global value chains. And how will this happen? Through the mechanism that I told you. If what the studies are telling us is that if the market, if trade begins to flow freely within this huge continent, then there will be increased investment and increased new activities that are not taking place today. And that will generate this boost that we are generating, that we're talking about, leading for, at the end, what we want. I mean, trade is not about figures or statistics. It's about generating jobs, about economic, social, and environmental upgrading. This is also important. With all these flow investment, we are expecting that new technologies will come up, that new ways of producing things, clean energy, access to very basic things that the African rural communities still do not have today. And also, let's not underestimate the process itself. The process itself, even though the Africa Continental Agreement right now is only a piece of paper, because the key point is whether this will become alive or not, the process is beginning to be interesting, because for the first time, we are having forums like this one, talking about Africa as a whole, connecting civil society or academic community like this, and interacting with private sector and other stakeholders, or to discuss a particular project, which is this treaty, right? This will generate pressure for governments and for civil society to deepen this dialogue, to deepen this evidence, to deepen these studies, to see how they work. And discussing, this is extremely important too, the trade agreements, even if they are implemented, they are not magic. They are not enough to ensure development. They are necessary, but they are not enough. The key point of free trade agreements is to enable these flows of trade and investment, but the key point is what governments will do as a complementary agenda to work with the affected sectors to maximize the potential opportunities of this agreement. And that's what we call complementary agenda, to focus competitiveness with a sustainable and inclusive approach. The opportunity to open this market is generating this excuse to talk about it. And this is extremely important, linking trader and investors, and also position Africa worldwide. Today, Africa is one of the less integrated continents in the planet that is not benefiting from globalization. While in regions like South Asia, poverty has decreased significantly, up to 60%, basically because of trade and investment flows and new global chains. This is the story of China, but it's also the story of India, it's the story of Bangladesh, it's the story of Vietnam, it's the story of Cambodia. Poverty is being decreased there. In Africa, there's some progress, but we haven't been able to connect Africa yet to that. And that's the whole point of this agreement. The last slide, and with this I will begin to wrap up, is that when we talk about rural development, it's very important to take into consideration that the Africa Continental FTA is a comprehensive agreement that goes beyond trading goods. Okay, it will negotiate. It will include disciplines on services, include disciplines on intellectual property, competition, investment, and e-commerce. So this should have an impact on rural development beyond agriculture, right? So let me tell you here. To wrap up, a real example of my country. I come from Costa Rica, as Pamela mentioned, and we are a country that as late as 1990s, we used to depend on exports of coffee and bananas. Coffee and bananas represented 75% of our exports. Today, we export the same, a little more, but they represent less than 12%. We now export more than 5,000 products, and the majority are services and medical devices and microchips and things. So we managed to transform the structure of the economy. And Costa Rica is a very small country, 4.5 million people, with no natural resources like Africa. Sometimes that's a blessing, some people say, because sometimes to be rich in the natural resource course is challenging. But the key point is that generated a pattern of flows of investment where the economy was transformed, and that had a lot of impact in the rural community. So the rural communities that traditionally were involved only in agriculture began to become involved in other activities like tourism. And when I say tourism, I mean high-end tourism. So for example, we have a chain of a program of rural development on tourism where high-end tourists that pay more than $1,000 per day go and spend their vacations and their time, their days with rural communities. So there was a whole program to how to increase the capacity of the rural communities to receive these people. And they want to learn about culture. This is not the typical tourist. This is people who want to learn about traditions, who want to learn about culture, who want to learn about farming, who want to learn about the real world. So this doesn't entail a change in cultural patterns. This actually is a preservation of that, what this particularly niche. Yes, this niche of tourism is very small when we talk about worldwide, but it's huge when we talk about rural communities. And the other area was in research and biotechnology, maximizing the potential benefits of the rainforest. And we had a program incorporating people, farmers and people of rural communities that began to identify and work new species of insects and birds for purposes of biotechnology research. That's only one of the examples, but also the increase of investment has enabled investments in medical services, investment in computer services. We, for example, now, because of that, the coverage of internet, the investment, because of the bigger market or the liberalization, there was a huge investment in internet, and that generated access to schools in rural communities having high-tech technologies, medicines, etc. So the point here is that I want to just to have an eye opener that the potential. First of all, the message is, if a small country like Costa Rica, which is a smaller and was poorer or similar to Africa, the hope for Africa is bigger. Now, does it mean that everything will be rosy, that everything will be perfect? No, the agreement is only just an agreement. The key value of the agreement is that is like an excuse and pressure to make all of you discuss with governments and with regional institutions an agenda, right? You know, with a calendar. So you know what will happen in time. And the idea is what each government and each community and each civil society will do to maximize these calendars, to do this complementary agenda, and maximize the potential of this free trade agreement. That is not automatic. It's just the potential, but they will have it translated in practice in real impacts on the ground. And with this, the last slide is just to, for those of you who want to have access to the report, I included there the links. So all this report on the economic impacts of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is available. We are going to be publishing the second one later this year. So just look forward for you to keep wait for this news when we come up with the second part of the report. So I will stop here. Thanks a lot, Pamela, and to Andrew and Neva, and to IRS for giving the chance to be with me here today and enjoy this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Echandi. That was quite insightful. I don't know how many ifs you said. You said, if this is done, if this
Yeah,
is done.
yeah,
So
yeah.
basically, yeah, so what that means is really the Africa Free Trade Area is not necessarily a magic word,
No,
to wipe
yeah.
away all our problems, but
Development
the
is usually more complex, Pamela, as you know. Yes, you're totally
yes.
correct.
Yes, but I think it's a very good first step. And what's most important is the transformation on the ground, right from the people who export to that farmer, how do they get involved and benefit? So thank you very much. And that sets the ground for our next speaker, who is Neva, all the way from Brussels. You're welcome, Neva.
Yes, hi, thank you very much, Pamela. I would normally be tuning in from Basel, Switzerland, but a pleasure to really be here talking to all of you today about such an important subject. So, I mean, really, we heard in the previous presentation by Roberto just the importance of free trade and ultimately what I like to call the road to prosperity. Now, Africa is the fastest growing continent in the world, but it does also contain more than half of the world's population facing food insecurity. And of course, what we're really keen to ensure also is that the current health crisis does not turn into, and in some cases, even more of a food crisis. So really, I mean, facilitating trade within Africa, we see it as being a powerful tool to helping achieve sustainable development, not only for tackling poverty and generating inclusive growth, empowering rural areas, but also for generating food security. So I think it will come as no surprise, as Pamela mentioned, given my work for Syngenta, I will be focusing on the agriculture side of the dynamic and the discussion. Now, agriculture is a key industry in Africa. It accounts for a large portion of people's livelihoods and the region's economy. And SSA alone, Sub-Saharan Africa alone, you've got 23% of the country's GDP coming from agriculture. And with the liberalization of trade, we do see a lot of potential. Now, of course, it needs to be implemented by all signatories, and that timetable we saw, it does need to be stuck to, but of course we do need to see the harmonizing of risk-based standards, registration and licensing systems across Africa in a simple, flexible, transparent, business-friendly and predictable manner. So just to give you guys an example, for seed to be treated, the crop protection often needs to be separately registered in each country. So the lack of harmonized regulations is also an impediment in turn to local seed companies, for example, being able to respond swiftly to challenges like fall armyworm, which are posing a serious threat to food security and people's livelihoods in an already fragile context. Now, I'll move on to my next slide. I want to really be starting with the sustainability angle and just explain a little bit what we are doing as Syngenta to help unlock Africa's potential sustainably. And ultimately in doing so, we're also helping build resilience into the market so that farmers can compete more effectively, not only within Africa, but also internationally. So sustainability, I mean, some of you might say, okay, but what is sustainability? So it's all about meeting today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to do so as well. And our Good Growth Plan sets out to achieve exactly that, so that agriculture functions within the boundaries of our planet. And we've really been setting the tone for our industry with pride in this area. So we have been, we launched our Good Growth Plan in 2013. And when we took stock of how we were doing on our commitments in 2019, we were really quite proud to see that we'd helped increase the average productivity of the world's major crop by 20% without using more land, water, or inputs, because of course, land is not an infinite source, and neither is water. The other thing, of course, is we reached 20 million smallholders, helping increase their productivity by 50% 50%. And we also trained over 4 million people on health and safety. So we renewed our Good Growth Plan commitments last year, and what you're seeing here on this slide is our new Good Growth Plan commitments. So we found that when we were talking to farmers, we asked them what the key challenges were that they were facing, and the overwhelming majority said climate change. So we really put climate change at the heart of our Good Growth Plan. So we're accelerating innovation for farmers in nature, providing sustainable solutions for farmers. Our target is to invest $2 billion in sustainable agriculture breakthroughs by 2050 and to deliver 2 sustainable technology breakthroughs per year. We're striving for carbon neutral agriculture. We're committed to reducing the carbon intensity of our operations by 50% by 2030. And of course, we are partnering for impact. So on the next slide, what I would like to do is explain to you guys one of our projects. So Mavuno Saidi, I mean, this is one of the ways in which we're doing it. So Mavuno Saidi is a project that we have brought to life with partners in East Africa, through which we're helping increase yields by helping remove the key market barriers that smallholders face. And as you guys will know, the majority of farmers in Africa are smallholders. So about 60% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa are smallholder farmers. And ultimately, with partners, we're providing access to finance, training on good agronomic practices, and helping link the farmers to market. We've empowered over 69,000 smallholders through Mavuno Saidi to date, and the project is ongoing, of course, and we have plans to scale it up. So it's not the only example. I mean, we have other examples in place. One that some of you might have seen recently in the media is the partnership we have with the Ministry of Rice Promotion in the Ivory Coast. And again, it's a combination of providing access to finance, training to good agronomic practices, linking farmers to market, but also we've got the technology side there as well. And we're bringing the 4th industrial revolution and all that has to offer to farmers as well with partners like Six Grain. Now, free trade, if we go to the next slide, I just really want to kind of touch on some of the potentials, because at the start, I mentioned 4 areas to you. I talked about tackling poverty, generating inclusive growth, empowering rural areas, and generating food security. Now, when we look at the free trade agreement, I mean, free trade can enable sustainable transformation of rural communities so that farmers get timely access to the inputs they need and have better access to the markets where they can sell their products. But really, it's about implementation and it's about partnering for impact. So it's really important to have those dialogues to understand what farmers need, the bottlenecks that are in place that farmers and businesses are facing. And by removing intra-African trade, we potentially also reduce the carbon footprint of the agriculture industry, as it will be easier to reduce supply and source from within Africa. But one thing I really do want to also underline is that international angle, because we also need to be able to access, well, farmers need to be able to access the necessary tools for sustainable growth in Africa. So when they're facing pest pressures like fall armyworm and desert locusts, which really, I mean, they're almost on a biblical scale when you look at the devastation they cause and are able to cause. Farmers do need access to those technologies to sustainably manage those challenges, and also they need access to high value markets for the crops that they grow. So one thing that would be counterproductive is that as Africa opens up the barriers to trade within the continent, we see barriers coming up potentially in other parts of the world. So that's one of the key things to watch out. And the African Continental Free Trade Area as a trading bloc will also need to look into how it advocates the interests of the key exporters in Africa so that they can continue, if not improve, their access to those high value markets internationally as well. Now, let me move on to really quickly the part about poverty reduction. So we heard from Roberto about how free trade areas, the African Free Trade Area has the potential to lift 30 million Africans out of extreme poverty. Now, studies also suggest that in Africa, for every 10% increase in farm yields, poverty falls by 7%. Another thing to kind of keep in mind is really the inclusive growth angle, because by reducing the cost of business, by enabling timely access to technologies, and by ensuring consistent and reliable market access, we also make the market more accessible to different parts of society who might have otherwise been priced out of those opportunities. So I just want to highlight one key point, which is transportation costs, which is something that our industry knows all too well. So transportation costs are on average 63% higher than in developed countries. This is a key bottleneck that definitely needs to be addressed. And it's really crucial because getting a product to a farmer in a timely manner makes all the difference for their harvest, as they have a window to really sow their seeds and use the inputs that they need to save their crops from potentially devastating pests and diseases. Now, I want to give two examples as well when it comes to consistent and reliable access. One of them is the kind of issue that recently happened in terms of the prevention of the sale of maize in Kenya coming from Uganda and Tanzania. So this is an example of a non-tariff barrier that did pose a risk to livelihoods and farmers producing the maize, but it also happened without much notice, and then it was lifted without much notice as well. So it's really, that reliable and consistent access element is really crucial. The other thing is crop protection products registered in Kenya cannot be sold in Tanzania. There are rules with respect to labels and registration protocols, and in spite of the East African Community Economic Bloc, which allows free movement of people and goods, crop protection products cannot be moved freely. So Uganda, on the other hand, has a more accessible market to Kenya. So these are the kind of things that we also need to look at, as they do limit opportunities and can have quite widespread impact. Now, in terms of empowering rural areas, the key thing to kind of also bear in mind there is that there is a huge potential. I mean, it's the $35 billion spent on food imports in Africa to feed cities can be used to fuel the economic growth of rural areas instead. But what we need to do to achieve that is ultimately help farmers increase their yields, because the average African farmer performs at only 40% of its potential. Now, this potential can be realized through a combination of improved agronomic practices, improved seed, and improved productivity enhancing inputs, such as, access to productivity enhancing inputs and their use, such as equipment, fertilizer, and plant protection products. A bit of a tongue twister there. So the low productivity and yield gaps are among the main constraints facing small and medium-scale farmers, who account, as I mentioned, for a large portion of Africa's population. The other thing that really is, important to kind of highlight here, and I just want to go back to the point about the bottlenecks. In terms of empowering rural areas, you need to make sure that they really do get access to the inputs they need. And some of the issues we faced in December, for a truck to cross two borders to go to Mozambique and drive approximately 600 to 700 kilometers from Lusaka took 15 to 20 days. I mean, these are the kind of challenges that for a small business will not be feasible. So it's really those kind of barriers that do need to be removed for inclusive growth, and to make sure that farmers get the inputs that they need in a timely manner. And just to underline, and this is my final point, the importance of this for food security. Africa does have huge potential as a continent containing 60% of the world's arable land. But, on current projections, it's only set to produce 13% of its food security needs by 2050. And it's really crucial, therefore, that we do get this right. And we have free trade agreements in place that are implemented in a way that enhances our agility as well, and our ability to respond to those evolving challenges in a timely manner. I mentioned fall Armenian desert locust infestations. Now, they pose a risk to the livelihoods and food security of over 300 million people in Africa. And it is estimated that 17.7 million tons of maize, a staple crop for food security, enough to feed tens of millions of people, can be lost annually to fall armyworm in Africa if left untreated. So it's really crucial that we enable access to those technologies and that we put in place the necessary free trading measures to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Neva. I think that's been extremely, extremely informative, and especially when you talk about how this impacts the rural farmer. At the end of the day, it all boils down to the people who are on the ground, the rural people. How does this impact on them? We know that post-harvest losses are very high because of precisely what you've said: no technologies, no infrastructure, transportation costs being high. And at the end of the day, these are the barriers that could affect the implementation of the African Free Trade Agreement. But we hope that, with time, all these barriers will be systematically removed so that we see and visualize the real benefits. So on that backdrop, I will invite Dr. Andrew to also give us his insights. Dr. Andrew, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. Okay, thanks a lot. So briefly, I'll make 3 critical points. That we should be careful not to repeat what we saw in the late 90s and 2010s when Africa grew, but poverty was still a stark reality. Number 2, we also ought to be aware that the promise of this free trade is mainly hinged on manufacturing, light manufacturing, textiles, and agro processing. Finally, there is the need to understand that these discussions here are not in the domain of the rural populations who we are thinking of integrating and helping them get something out of the free trade. My point is, in the 2000s, 2010s, we saw growth in many African countries, but we still saw many of those countries not reducing poverty as much as one would expect. And a typical example can be some East African countries. Those I'm familiar with is Tanzania. So a further dig into the data suggests that there were critical mismatches. The growth was occurring in sectors which was not being participated in by the poor. So if there are so many poorer people in the rural areas and growth is not occurring in agriculture, then definitely there's going to be an issue. The growth was observed in services and manufacturing, and so the poor did not benefit. Number 2, many of the simulations which have been undertaken suggest that we are going to see growth in trade in manufactured products. But our rural folks are not those involved in this manufacturing. So how do we turn things around to make it possible for rural dwellers, economic agents in the rural areas to participate in this all-important agro-processing and other light manufacturing within the context of free trade area? And I think it's an area to watch. Please, can we go to the next slide? So we can move to the next. So as I said earlier on, manufacturing represents the main center of action, followed by agriculture. All the simulations suggest same. Services will follow later. But for now, how do we ensure that the rural folks who are primarily agricultural based feed into this manufacturing and ensure that they get benefits of the growth? Whenever we talk about trade, then you must have something to sell or be part of the facilities and actions which allows the trade to happen. Do our farmers and rural dwellers have a product to sell? There might be different views, but the fact that we are importing several billions worth of food to come and meet the demands of our countries suggests that even to feed our own countries, the farms here are unable to meet that. So do they have products to sell to others? Maybe not. And a typical example is last year when Ghana estimated producing 3 million tons of maize. There was a shortfall of about 1.2 million because of drought, flooding, etc., and the influx of buyers from Burkina Faso. So there are countries in the Sahel which need maize, but we are unable to supply. So one way to think about this whole activity is, first of all, improve the activities undertaken by our farmers to ensure that, first and foremost, the food demand gaps are met. And I like what Neva mentioned about the fact that the same resources we are using to import food can serve as resources to bring progress and productivity improvement in the rural sector. So how do we do that? And as I mentioned, agro processing is key. There are two critical things to look at in the agricultural sector for attention to be paid. Mechanization, irrigation, very critical. If I am a food processor and I'm looking at supplying products into the African market through the free trade agreement, I am most likely to be looking out for farmers who can be relied upon to supply certain quality of inputs at certain times. Here is the case where many of our farms are rain-fed. Even crops like rice, which require a lot of water all year round, so we can do, let's say, 2 or 3 times of the production. The irrigation infrastructure does not exist. So how do we get that resolved? There are now younger and more daring youths in the continent who are willing to partake in relatively small to medium scale irrigation schemes and bring others on board to produce. How do we ensure that these young people have access to the all needed capital? And this is an old age discussion and argument we've had since the early 90s till date. But the reality is that when a producer, a rural dweller, willing to invest in the missing middle, the processing of agro products, etc., goes to the bank to get resources, they are likely to be quoted between 20 and 30% interest. How does any producer produce 10 things around and go back and pay? That cannot happen. So recent studies we've had suggest that these young people can manage between 3 and 8% of interest, but not many banks are willing or ready to put that forward. So how do we turn things around? We know that governments have been subsidizing inputs for many countries around Africa. But what we see is that input subsidies do not produce higher productivity when compared with direct transfers, other transfers that they will not bring back or transfers that they might pay back. It might even be better to push some of these subsidies directly into the hands of the entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs who understand what they are doing, to go in there and begin to turn things around. So as we left entrepreneurs in specific efficiency centers across the towns and districts of the communities in Africa, it is likely that they would also bring profits which can be shared with the local communities, and then rural development occurs. A second critical problem with the agricultural sector, as Neva mentioned in brief, is the seed system. And here, I'm not concerned about the institutional arrangements around licensing, but the institutional arrangements around monitoring of the quality of seed, the reliability of the seed, that I am taking a seed and not grain, the policing of seed systems is quite weak. And sometimes farmers go to buy the seeds, and what they are getting is grain. They plant and they don't get the right outcome. How do we bring the production and then the manufacturing side together? Formally, we've talked about farmer-based organization enhancing their activities, promoting what they do. But I think it's about time we move forward. There are difficulties in moving forward to create innovation platforms where we have both farmers and manufacturers coming together to think through what ought to be done. So if I am a processor of rice and I need long grains, the farmer should not go and plant before they go around looking for the buyer. The planting and the processing activities must be thought through together. And this processor must also be given or must be aware of the final destination of what they are producing. And this is when government interventions come in to ensure that they are facilitating the processors, giving them information to know that, hey, there is demand for rice, long grain rice in, let's say, Niger, and they need this quantity. Then the processors collaborate with the rural centers to produce what they are going to export. That requires a lot of research, not a rigorous econometric research. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about missions of countries in other African countries, listening to what is needed in those countries and bringing information back to their producers to know what to send abroad within the continent. And that is critical because all the conversation can be had in the corridors of power in Ethiopia, in Accra, and elsewhere. But if that conversation is not brought into the domain of the farmers and the agro processors, I doubt if there will be any progress. So information, research, and then critically finance. We also need to think about how we nurture local entrepreneurs. There are young people between the ages of 24 and 32 who are very anxious and very interested in making things happen. How do we nurture them? There should be a deliberate attempt to create some winners. Select young people in, let's say, Kampala, Uganda, and the villages surrounding, and say, I'm putting you in the cotton gin industry to do A, B, and C, and take off the produce of the farmers and send to a country B or C. We also have to understand that not all the regions on the continent are the same. And specifically, there are typical issues with the Central African region when it comes to infrastructure. But when you come to, let's say, East Africa or West Africa or Southern Africa, many of the infrastructure problems we talk about, they have not gone away, but it is possible to move things from Accra to Monrovia on road. So as we remove the tariffs, I'm sure, and other barriers, I'm sure we can move things around much quicker. But the countries where we know, those we have given 6 to 13 years before the negotiations take place, those are the places we should watch. That at the this time that they have been given to prepare themselves, they get access to the right information and prepare themselves so that when the trade opens up, they can also enter it. And all the countries across Africa will win together. It's not surprising that places like Ivory Coast are going to be the most beneficiaries. They have infrastructure for manufacturing, and that is the issue. So how do we get other places to build their capacity in agro processing to ensure that they bring up other rural economies which are producing other inputs? In my mind, there's a need for a value chain discussion, bring the participants onto an innovation platform for each country. And that strategic planning will be required for countries to make it. Otherwise, we would come back to the table and say that the Continental Free Trade Area did not deliver. Can we go to the next slide, please? So if you think about a place like Burkina Faso, they produce cotton, and probably send it all out of Africa. Meanwhile, there are rural dwellers in Ghana who are weaving kente. How do we get the people in Burkina Faso to send these cotton yarns to the Ghanaian weavers to produce the kente and send them back to Kenya or Uganda, where there are many tourists looking out for these products? So in my mind, efficiency centers ought to be identified. And at the starting point, we don't need to do all things at once, but identify specific areas where we can directly link agriculture to light manufacturing and processing, and identify the markets and link them up. We are happy to get investors come to us, but I am of the view that it is also about time that we created entrepreneurs within the continent. If you come to places where mining has gone on several years in Ghana, you do not see the transformation that is required. So we are now concerned that young people are mining the gold themselves, but I don't think we can blame them much. If firms have come from abroad, invested, and we can't put blame on anybody, but we cannot see transformation, then there is a problem with that structure. So as we look out for investments from abroad, which is critical, we also need to pay attention to developing our own entrepreneurs who will be part of the rural economy and lift people out of the challenge. And we've met young people who understand this and are doing great jobs. A young man here in Ghana finished university 2012, looked for a job for some time, did not find one, went back to his village and began a rice processing plant. He looked for resources for a long time. He didn't get that. So he partnered with other friends and they brought money together to do it. Today, he has about 500 farmers for whom he mills rice. At the same time, he also gives them assistance in preparing their land and planting the field, sometimes even harvesting. And this is within the space of about 6 to 8 years. No experience in the area, but with his knowledge from school, he came in and he's making changes. That is the kind of organic progress we are looking for. If you go to Tanzania too, there are young people who have moved from Dar es Salaam, initially planting vegetables, gone into the Mwanza area, gone into places where they can plant rice, and they are making significant changes, especially when it comes to mechanization. How do we get more of such? And for me, it's important for individual countries to begin thinking about, even if it's a raffle, to get 300 people across the districts in the regions and say, hey, our objective is for you to look at your district and put together something which will feed into the continental free trade area. Next slide, please. The same can be done with the car industry. If you think about Nigeria and Ghana today, assembling has started again. So are there things that can be produced here? There are people producing skin or hide in Burkina Faso, Niger. How do we get them to process this into fine leather that we can use in the car manufacturing industry? Those conversations ought to be had. Next slide, please. The same vein, we collect all the cocoa in Ivory Coast and Ghana and send it elsewhere. Of course, it's those who can buy who buy. But this time, we also believe strongly that there are consumers on the African continent looking for fine chocolate like this. So can there be a country, maybe Benin, Togo, who is also willing to take cocoa from Ghana and Ivory Coast and put them in this form and send it to a market like Nigeria? The same can be thought of for South Africa, where many or most of the wine they produce does not end up on the African continent. It goes to Europe. So how do we encourage them to send it into our own system and see what will happen to the youth? In my mind, it's time for us to rethink the way things have happened. And the way to do it is to link the agricultural sector to the low-hanging fruits in manufacturing, especially agro processing. And that way, we can push things forward and will not return to the table in 15 years and be concerned that, yes, the trade has happened, but the beneficiaries of trade have been mainly people outside of the continent. And one of the things the discussion is going on around is the rules of origin, which I believe is going to be very important, because eventually we might have people bringing things into Benin, Ghana, or Togo, put them together and send them to Kenya and say it has been produced in Ghana. That is not what we want. So extra policing to ensure that the rules of origin are ensured will be required. Thank you very much.